I'm trying to start a project, trying to fundraise, which is harder here, which will be something like, the idea is about feeding Durban, the transformation of an agri-food system in the 20th and 21st century. In one sense, this is very new. I suspect I'm going to learn more from you and watching and listening to you than you're going to learn from me. Yet at the same time, the origins of these interests go back a couple of decades to 2002, when I was a very young, maybe naive, postgraduate student, newly arrived in Durban, and in my very first week in the city, my development studies master's class, we got taken to visit this groundbreaking project, which is at the downtown transport hub.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't.
No. You have to go. Unfortunately, you have to go to the. That's magic. No, it doesn't.
We'll work at the wrong end.
Yeah, we'll do it the
Try that? I don't know why.
Ye of little faith.
Can you please be on this side if you want to move that, because there is the microphone.
Oh, I see, I apologise. Right, okay. So anyway, here's Durban. Here's the downtown transport hub. You see it looking busy. Early 20th, late 20th century. A series of markets, they've been the belly of the city since its very inception. Anyway, so there we were at this award-winning project where we were meeting poor, vulnerable female street traders, quite a number of them widows, hence the title, who had colonised, taken over these pavements as apartheid spatial segregation collapsed in the late 1980s. And very recently, after 1994, they had just been provided municipal facilities by a progressive post-apartheid city hall. What I soon came to realise was that for the sorts of international policymakers who tour the global south in search of examples of spatial justice, Durban was a laboratory for the attempts to produce a fairer city that put the first last. It's not my picture. I've taken it from the US World Resources Institute, Ross Centre promoting sustainable cities, Durban winning a prize. These markets feature a huge amount in that sort of literature, and behind that sort of progressive policy making focused on the needs of vulnerable women traders, there is a huge weight of social history writing. You know, as Noor, I'm sure, said, sorry I missed it yesterday, but you know, this remarkable generation of social history writers committed to writing the history of cities from below, through the eyes of, we might say in France, the popular classes, a rich stream of writing on, you know, women beer brewers, domestic workers, written by, you know, people such as this chap here, Phil Bonner and Noor. Wonderful book, wonderful book. And what I want to do in this paper, Problematique, is ask what sorts of knowledge about female African street traders have been produced by that nexus of social historians and progressive policymakers go very much together, and at the same time, what do we miss, and where might I be able to do a project, perhaps? Because my tentative suggestion, very new days, is that we've perhaps in South Africa spent so much time doing research from below that female street trader has almost become a cliche. And as much as South African radical researchers are great at telling the story of the transformation from below, how the collapse of a peasant economy, rural forced removals, apartheid, break open, smash rural households, releasing a flood of poor, vulnerable women into the city where they've got to hustle their living. What we might not be so good at doing is thinking about the resilience of these women and how they connect into wider, larger, wealthier agri-food systems. To give a sense, we were told this, I remember in the early 2000s, we were told by the lady who took us here that the turnover, cash going through hands at Warwick Junction, downtown, was the same as what was then the largest shopping mall south of the Sahara. The Pavilion, Durban, subsequently the bigger ones elsewhere. But the vast volumes of cash going through. And so, what I am hoping to do if I ever get this project off the ground is to search for methodologies and sources that would allow me to trace agri-food systems, so you can map it out. This is how you bring, for instance, cows' heads to market, through smallholders, through bulking yards, through speculators, through feedlots. And where do those women traders you see at Warwick Junction and elsewhere, where do they fit into that? And how does it change over time, over the 20th century? And what I hope to do in the rest of this paper is to quickly outline what little I know about how these agri-food systems have changed and suggest ways we might be able to think about them systematically. Paper comes in 3 parts. First, Durban, like many cities on the east coast of the continent, is set into the Indian Ocean world. So in the first half of the 20th century, Durban is basically fed by Indian market gardeners and petty traders. Second, along comes apartheid in 1948, and in subsequent decades, urban planners modernise, rebuild the city in a way that does all sorts of things, including favouring big business, not least the supermarkets that sees dominant share of agri-food systems. Yet, at the same time, to return back to what we're talking about today, women street traders have worked in this city from the very start. Most famously, perhaps, Jacob Zuma's mother, when she's widowed, he's a young boy, she goes on her own to Durban, where she hustles a living in the streets. And in the final decade of apartheid, just kind of like what we saw, women working in markets. As the structures of urban segregation collapse, other things are going on elsewhere, looking same in the continent. The weight of female street trade increases hugely in the city, and Warwick Junction is transformed into a space dominated by African female street traders. So how do they interact with these other layers of systems? That's the questions I'm asking myself, trying to think through how to answer. Okay, so to start with, some history. Yep, Durban set into the Indian Ocean world, specifically from 1860 to 1911. It's 160,000 indentured labourers shipped across to work in Natal on the sugar plantations. At the same time, several thousand high caste merchants and their lawyers crossed the Indian Ocean too, most famously Mahatma Gandhi. So like many port cities, you have this very tight nexus, incredibly tight, of Indian market gardeners and petty traders who supply the city with most of its fruit and veggies. Often the indentured labourers get out of indenture, set up market gardens, the higher bits of the value chain taken by those kind of richer merchants who had not been in indenture. And I've got a PhD student thinking a lot about the very tight bonds of family and caste which tie together this system of trade across all of Natal, even into small towns. You have these trading stores. This being a methodology workshop, thinking sources. I'm hoping, but I've not yet found, that Durban City Hall, racist white city fathers, are so annoyed that Indian merchants are eating their lunch that they are going to document what's going on. And they also have responsibility for things such as the early morning market. not found as much as I expected thus far. Second, in the middle of the century, a bunch of liberal anthropologists come along and want to see these cities, famously in Durban, Hilda Cooper. She writes of Durban as being, quotes, definitely in scare quotes, a plural city full of oriental bazaars and Indian markets. In the 1970s, 1980s, that remarkable generation of social historians, they revisit those mid-century archives and they want to retell that story in a different way as one of struggles for the city. Going back to Manuel Castells' Les Luttes Urbaines, Fred Cooper, Struggles for the City. And they want to see the nationalist mobilisations, the African Nationalist Congress, growth in the mid-20th century, being these struggles for the city. A story can be told in a major key. Nationalist mobilisation go together when you see huge city growth in those middle decades, migrants flooding into the city, challenging urban segregation. So that in Durban, the ANC's power in the city peaks in 1959 and 1960, at the same time as female beer brewers are doing their climactic protests, demanding, we want to stop being criminalised. These things go together. The story can also be told in a minor key, that as nationalists seize control of urban space, they sometimes take food markets and other markets from their competitors. So we see, and we have always seen in Durban, a wave of African nationalist mobilisation coinciding with attacks on Indian traders. Most famously, or most infamously perhaps, the 1949 riots targeting Indian traders, starting in that series of shops, markets and bus ranks around Warwick Junction in 1949. It spreads through the commercial networks of the city. It lasts a week, 142 people die. That was the shape of a port city in the Indian Ocean world up to the middle of the 20th century. But then, of course, as I said, along comes apartheid, and in the third quarter of the 20th century, apartheid urban planners build a racially, spatially segregated modernist city, so bulldozing the shanty towns, rebuilding these kind of edge city townships, often, and we might want to think about this more as South Africanists, in a way that favours corporate capital, not least the supermarkets, who start building stores in the African townships as they seize a dominant share of agri-food systems. And in South Africa, this is Boxer supermarkets, low prices for the people. One of the big innovators, moving supermarkets away from the well-heeled white suburban clients into these new growing urban popular markets. And that trend will only continue after 1994 because of the weight of redistribution in South Africa, grandma's pension. Popular urban consumption has increased as child hunger has halved. Supermarkets love redistribution. Now this means that by 2014, the big five South African supermarkets control about 70% of the food retail market, $1.2 billion in profits, a concentration that is perhaps more akin to North America than seen elsewhere. And so there's a huge stream of radical South African food researchers focused on the evils of the big supermarkets seizing market share, dominating food retail systems from smaller producers. An argument made in an intellectual key by the South African Competition Commission that has recently, in the last 10 years, launched a series of investigations targeting monopolistic supermarkets. This economic research playing out in a more demotic political key when post-apartheid African National Congress politicians demanding radical economic transformation launch violent verbal attacks on white monopoly capital, Indian traders, people who have, quote, we will remove that piece of meat from their mouth. There was a chant going up in Warwick Junction led by some radical economic transformation politicians about 10 years ago. So it's complicated politics. Yet at the same time, what the supermarkets would say, and they've told me, and certainly what some of the surveys point to, and South Africa is blessed with a huge amount of social science surveys which may be somehow pieced together to build up a broader picture. What these surveys suggest to us is actually a more complex, interconnected relationship between supermarkets, small spaza shops and street traders. I couldn't quite find a picture, but you see it very visually if you go to Warwick Junction, and alongside the big supermarkets, you will have traders literally in the street outside the door. And the supermarkets will talk a very good game of how they learnt to operate alongside the street traders and the minibus taxi operators. To put things fairly bluntly, in the 1980s we beat them away. They wouldn't ever say that, but you see that's what they did. It's in the newspapers. But by the 2000s, they will be building facilities for the minibus taxis, some of them even providing street traders with basic facilities. Because behind that perhaps is quite a complex symbiotic relationship where both are being able to benefit, though I'm still not quite sure why. Which brings me on to a third point. Supermarkets want to talk a story of enlightened self-interest. There's also, frankly, a story of political reality. After the structures of urban segregation collapse, they can basically no longer depend on a racist white police force to defend their space from them. And they are forced into alliances, whether they like it or not, with powerful informal sector forces, shall we call them, in downtown Durban. To put things fairly bluntly, if you do wrong things, the Minibus Taxi Association will burn down your supermarkets. But as we saw in the riots in 2021, if you get on well with them, they will defend them for you. And that was clearly seen. What is the broader story behind this? Well, number one, there's just this huge demographic change of this East Coast city. It's largely from Hilda Cooper's, scare quotes, plural cities of Indian markets and bazaars to a huge demographic weight. And behind that is the collapse of spatial segregation from, I couldn't quite find a Durban one, this is more of a Johannesburg sort of a map, because they're the mines as well, but you have your suburbs, you have your townships on the edge, and then since apartheid, yes, the old suburbs, the new suburbs, the security estates, the golf estates, the townships which are growing, huge informal settlements, grown, tenfold in the past 20 years. And in that fragmentation of the city, we find that new pattern of Warwick Junction, in that as spatial segregation collapses, 19,000 pavement traders move onto the streets, about half of them setting up around Warwick Junction. And in their patterns of trade, an indication of how the shape of South Africa's cities change, as that far more mobile, fragmented pattern of urbanism emerging. And another axis of research I am trying to think about is, how does food get to market? Because from what little we have seen, there are all sorts of statistics suggesting interesting relationships between female street traders and what are by and large male truckers and traders. So everything from the minibus taxis, which bring 500,000 people into town every day, as they walk through the markets to make the connection to the next minibus or maybe to the train, to the brother and sister businesses, which may bring in things such as goats. Half the goats in South Africa, despite, segregation and apartheid, half the livestock in South Africa is still in African hands, despite forced removals, despite land expropriation. And finally, some very interesting commercial relationships with commercial white farmers who realise this is a wealthy sector and are trying to themselves, it would seem, find their ways into it. If you talk to people like the livestock auctioneers, who once would be auctioning only for quote-unquote white commercial farms, they're now, quote-unquote, they would say, we're going into the communal sector, going into the chieftaincy areas, because there's money in the hills. So, to bring me to a conclusion, South Africa's social historians, I belong to that stream of research, standing on the shoulders of giants. They've done a brilliant job, for many decades of analysing, documenting social histories of vulnerable categories of women workers operating in what was once called the urban informal economy across the 20th century into the 21st. What we might also want to do is to think how they fit into agri-food systems, which have changed dramatically in living memory. And this was my old boss, Phil Bonner, working at that time with Usindima. So good at getting interviews. So they'd interviewed some unemployed street mechanic who had all of a sudden gone into business after a very fortunate meeting with a female trader. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, she was rich. And I want to find more beautiful, intelligent and rich women during the course of my research. Thank you.